Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for your patience as we're just kind of trying to get things together behind the scenes. So thank you very much. And thank you for everybody's questions. We've got a lot, so we'll try to get through what we can. So I think one of the things we could talk about a little bit is trying to maybe a little bit more specific about where, when we talk about regenerative medicine, where are we talking about actually in terms of the inner ear? So I don't know if anybody would like to jump in on that one of the panelists to just kind of give a little bit of a background of kind of where we're talking about in terms of regenerative medicine and what we're targeting.
I can start if you'd like, Carrie.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Carl.
Okay, so there are cells in the inner ear. These are called supporting cells or progenitor cells. They're stem-like cells. And the interesting thing about in the human ear is that they're dormant. They're only providing structure and support and a little bit of communications, but their job in development was to generate hair cells. And so what we're doing by delivering drug to the ear is we're waking those cells up and trying to coax them to generate new hair cells again and hopefully restore function. So this requires an intratympanic injection to the ear, and then the drugs will diffuse into the inner ear and hopefully target those progenitor cells.
Great. Thank you, Carl, for that little bit more of a background. I don't know, Chris, anything to add about that at all?
Yeah, I think just from seeing some of the questions that have come through about, some of them are related to that. So there's the question, what exactly is it that we're doing? And as Carl said, we're stimulating these supporting cells to function more like hair cells and transducers to get the sound, get better sound quality. The other piece is that some people were asking how they might know if, what are the signals that need to be turned on? How do I know if I would be a candidate for that? And that's one of the things we were talking about as far as the health of the ear. So there has to be, those are the structures that do need to be in place. And as best we can tell, we will try to select candidates for this therapy that we would anticipate at least have these supporting cells in place, because that's the place where we need to turn on. And so that's what we would be looking for in someone to benefit from this therapy.
Great. And I know we touched on a little bit, but as we think about regenerative medicine, just to maybe expand a little bit further, how do we see it fitting in with somebody who has a cochlear implant already? You know, let's say if somebody's saying, okay, maybe in the next, like we talked about, decade, that this may be ready for prime time, as people are thinking about, you know, is this something that I should be holding out for or thinking about versus, you know, getting a cochlear implant? You know, how do you kind of think about or counsel patients? I don't know, either Chris or Justin, kind of from a clinician perspective.
I only heard the first part of the second part of the question because I had some tech issues and just joined. So I'll let you take it, Christina.
Okay. My personal approach to this is to say, until this is a treatment or a therapy is solidly in our toolbox, it's FDA approved and available, I would not wait. I wouldn't save an ear for that treatment. The reason I say this is because while right now we are very, very close, we're doing clinical trials with humans. This sort of conversation was actually happening about 25 years ago when we were first talking about this, and people were talking about not getting a cochlear implant or saving an ear, maybe not implanting a child to wait for therapy to come through. But it's been 25 years. And so I think we do, as much as these therapies can very much enhance how we treat hearing loss, we do have good options that we know much more about, and we know who are candidates for what types of different interventions. And I would recommend going forward with something. We don't want to keep people from getting treatment for hearing loss, or we don't want people to not address hearing loss to wait for something when we don't know exactly when it will come. So that's my expert opinion on that. Is I recommend people do what they can to treat the hearing loss they have with what's available now.
I figured out what the question was based on the answer, so I could go now. This is a very hard question to answer, and it sometimes can make me a little uncomfortable when I try to answer this. But putting on my clinician hat, we basically just counsel on what is available now or what is immediately in the pipeline. Like, we're sure it's coming in the next year, we just don't know exactly when. And so I would say, what we have now are hearing aids and cochlear implants. And so if you are a candidate, you should absolutely go ahead. Don't wait. The sooner the better. Maybe one day I will change my mind. I hope one day I change my mind, but I really cannot say when I'll change my mind. It's impossible to really know for sure.
Great, thank you. And then, Carl, I don't know if you could maybe speak to this question in terms of, we kind of broadly talked about hearing loss, and from a regenerative medicine perspective, is there any differentiation in kind of how we're thinking about these trials, or the trials where they're, recruiting currently, of thinking about individuals who have hearing loss from birth or very early versus who've acquired hearing loss later on? Is there kind of any difference in how you think about that or approach that?
Yeah, so the current drug candidate that we're working with, FX322, is designed to help individuals that have acquired sensory neural hearing loss. So it would not be the congenital forms, but acquired. And that's about 90% of hearing loss. And you can acquire hearing loss either by exposure to noise. It can be acute, it can be chronic. You can get it from aging, and you can get it from a virus at times. And also there are certain drugs that are ototoxic and cause hearing loss. So those would be the types of individuals that would be candidates for this treatment.
Great, thank you. And then in also thinking about the candidates potentially, for another question for you, Carl, in terms of the severity of hearing loss, that you're kind of looking for, whether now, and then if you have any thoughts about kind of in the future, would that change at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the subjects that we've studied to date are categorized as mild to moderately severe. And we chose to go into that group of individuals because the first thing that we had to do was test for safety. And oftentimes when people are developing drugs, they'll go into the more severe individuals first. But from our point of view, we wanted to go into that mild to moderately severe group so that we could make sure we didn't have a safety signal, that we weren't going to make hearing worse, right? And so that was the decision that we made. And we're currently studying that group. But there's no question, as we continue to advance the drug into larger trials and more trials, we will explore the boundaries of who it works in. We'll look in more severe settings, and we'll look in these different populations, how various people lost their hearing. So, we just have to understand who it works in and how it works and who it works best in. Right.
And then a question that I think came up a number of times was thinking about how to get involved in a clinical trial. And I think there was some also discussion in the chat about, clinicaltrials.gov and things. So I don't, Justin, if maybe you could speak to this a little bit in terms of if somebody is interested in a trial, that's something that you talk to them about in your clinical practice, or what would you advise? And then potentially Chris would want to weigh in as well.
Sure. So for those who don't know, there's an amazing resource, clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website through our
little repeat Justin coming in. He refreshed his browser.
What was that? Can you hear me okay? Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
We can hear you, Justin.
I heard speaking over my voice. There's a wonderful website, clinicaltrials.gov, and it's basically a registry of all clinical trials. And so I believe by law, if you are an organization, a university, or a company, and you have a clinical trial, it must be on that website. So it's completely comprehensive. If the clinical trial exists, it is on that website. If it's not on that website, it's not a legit clinical trial, and you probably should not join. So this is a great place to start, and it's a pretty user-friendly website. You can type in certain terms like hearing loss or regeneration, but it can get a little technical, and so I think it's nice to explore a little on there, but you should definitely see a physician, a specialist who can help tell you whether you might be a candidate for this trial or whether it makes no sense.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Justin. Chris, anything to add to that?
Honestly, I think participating in events like this, keeping your ear to the ground, I guess, if you will, about what's going on out there, staying active in the community. That's another way to hear about these sorts of trials and to find out. And once you find out about them, you can contact the companies directly, and they can tell you. So once you find out who's doing the trials or who's sponsoring the trial, what company, for example, or a university, you can contact those, and they can tell you the closest. If they have multiple sites, they can tell you what's closest to you and put you in touch with the people at those locations nearest you, and to find out if you're a candidate and if you want to travel to the site and participate.
And Carrie, could I add so from the sponsor side, because we sponsor a number of trials, it's crucial for us to remain independent from that process. And so what we do is we contact clinicians like Justin and Chris. We would select their institutions, and then they would identify the patients. We don't have any direct contact with patients whatsoever. We must maintain full separation and independence from the trial. That's the only way that we can determine if the drug can work. Those are very strict rules that we have to follow in this process as well.
Yeah, great, thank you for that. I don't know, Carl, if you do have, because I know there were some specific questions as well about kind of location, specifically for frequency therapy, like can people sign up now? And if so, where? If that's something you can discuss here, or even thinking about maybe future trials, any thoughts specific to frequency therapeutics?
Yes, so we have an ongoing trial now across the country. It's at 16 centers across the country, and you can go to the website that Justin described, clinicaltrials.gov, and if you just type in FX322 and you search for it, that study will pull up. And if you click on that study link, it'll say study locations, and there is a 1-800 number that will shuttle you to the appropriate location, right? We're not in every single city, but we're in cities across the entire country. So you go through that process, and hopefully you'll get connected to one of the sites, and then the process begins. Then you'll have a conversation with the site staff, the investigator, the audiologist, to determine whether your candidacy is acceptable according to the study protocol.
Okay, thank you. I think another really, I think, good question that came up here is thinking about, one of the things that's always tricky when we do research is we always want, that fairly specific inclusion criteria, just like you talked about, a certain type of hearing loss and potentially maybe a certain history of type of hearing loss and whatnot. And that tension between making sure we have a fairly specific person that we're looking at versus thinking about when we actually get the results, being able to generalize them to a broader population. And as we think about, just how many people have hearing loss and the fact that much of that is among older adults, do you have any thoughts or comments about, who is currently represented, or maybe that's not something you can discuss, or potentially who you're recruiting, in terms of age range for current studies, and kind of thinking about how representative or maybe not representative they are, of the population who has hearing loss?
Sure. Yeah. So on the age side, right now we're currently testing adults from the ages of 18 to 65 years of age. And as I mentioned earlier, they're in the mild to moderately severe category. And when you start trials, they tend to be at the beginning very restrictive. And then as you advance through, and as we talked about during session, we're in phase 2. So as you go through each phase, the restrictions become fewer and fewer and fewer. And that means you're allowing a broader population of individuals with the condition into the trial. I would say it's reasonable that the patients that we're currently evaluating right now in terms of how the drug works, I think that's probably representative of probably several tens of millions of subjects in this country right now. And as we talked about, we're going to get broader as we advance the product. So the future studies will be more open than the current ones are.
Great, thank you. Any other comments from Chris or Justin on that, or thinking about in terms of generalizability of trials, or any other thoughts to share on that?
Well put. Nothing to add.
Right.
Very good. Let me see here. There's at least one question I think is a little bit maybe quick to answer, Justin, or not, is thinking about kind of what, let's see. Like I said, a little bit off topic, but when you talk to patients about kind of the composition of the inner ear and kind of inner ear fluid, if we're talking about injections, and maybe Carl, this is something for you too, and we think about, if somebody maybe has Meniere's, and we talk to them about, salt intake, and then we're also, potentially injecting different drugs or things, how do we, are there different considerations to keep in mind of, how these drugs versus, other things like salt or whatnot affects the inner ear fluid? I guess kind of how much are we think about the inner ear fluid when we're thinking about, injections and medications, if that's the route of administration?
You mean in terms of the patient's disorder affects something about the inner composition that might make it, might affect the delivery of the drug?
Potentially, yeah. And I don't know, maybe Carl, if you had some thoughts in terms of maybe how the inner ear fluid, how do you take that into account when you're designing a medication that, that may interact with the fluid?
Well, I think one example would be, so if Justin were evaluating a subject for our current trial, he has to give the injection in order for the drug to get into the middle ear and for the molecules to diffuse into the inner ear. If he suspects that there's some middle ear disease of some kind, if they're chronic middle ear infections, or if the tympanic membrane has some abnormality associated with it, that one might think that would affect the way the drug would get to the site of action. So those would be instances where it would not be a good candidate. A lot of the time, though, it comes down to clinical judgment, right? We try to define as many of the inclusion and exclusion and be as clear as we possibly can with them, but sometimes Justin and Chris have to use their judgment as to whether or not they think this would be a good candidate for the study.
Yeah, I think the biggest exclusion criteria would be middle ear disease, but in terms of the inner ear, we don't really know that much about the inner ear. I mean, in Meniere's, we think that the fluid is a little bit, the pressure is a little high, but we don't really know too much about the inner ear. So I think if you have an inner ear and you have hearing loss and your middle ear is okay, you'd probably be a candidate for a lot of these therapies. Do you agree, Carl? You need an inner ear.
And then in thinking about other potential risk of these types of treatments, whether the balance system or other long-term effects are, I don't know, Chris, maybe if you could speak to this, or Carl, what are some of the potential risks that people should be thinking about when we talk about regenerative medicine or delivery into the middle ear or things like that?
Yeah, Carl, did you want to go ahead with that?
Sure, I can lead if you want to then follow. That's fine. So Carrie, it's interesting. One of the things that's known about, so we're targeting progenitor cells in the cochlea, and those cells respond to certain signals. And what we try to do is get them to signal by giving drugs, right? These small molecules typically. If you go over to the vestibular apparatus, the balance organ, there are progenitor cells there, but what's fascinating is they're under completely different signals. And so if one were going to use an approach like we're using, you'd probably have to design different drugs to turn those cells on. So it really becomes, what's your target? Do you understand the signaling systems that help define how they function? And once you can decode that, then you can usually, do a trial and test and see if you can have some sort of a benefit.
And then in terms of thinking about where you would get these injections done, is this something that would be, an ear, nose, and throat doctor, an audiologist, who would be delivering or dispensing these medications or these injections?
Go ahead, Justin, please.
Okay, I can comment and then you can follow. Probably would be an ear, nose, and throat physician. The injection through the eardrum is pretty straightforward. Probably, ultimately, any otolaryngologist could do that. You wouldn't necessarily have to see a subspecialist like someone like myself or Carrie. But in the beginning, it's often nice to see a subspecialist just because they're the ones that know about clinical trials and are involved in clinical trials. Audiology, in general, they're not doing procedures like injecting things through the eardrum. So unless there's a change in the nature of the profession and what they're licensed to do, it's probably going to be done by an ENT physician.
Yeah, I would agree with Justin. I think that the way that we look at this is today, ENTs don't really have a tool in the toolkit that's a therapeutic to help treat. They can diagnose, but in general, the treatment is occurring within the audiology space. And so what we're hopeful is we know the drug does need to be delivered by an ear, nose, and throat specialist. And they're going to be now part of the process. And what's nice is intratympanic injections, they're office-based. It's not a complicated procedure. And there's a billing code associated with it. So there's an economic element to this that's already hardwired. And I think we're just really excited to continue to build the partnership with people like Justin and Chris, and see if we can get this thing to work.
There's another question about, and I know we talked a lot about clarity and the importance of clarity. And is there kind of any kind of reason or thought of why there's been a focus, or it seemed to be a focus, in our discussions about clarity versus, volume, and kind of being able to increase people's ability to hear something in terms of amplification versus the clarity? I don't know if there's anybody, Chris or Carl, that could kind of speak to why was there so much discussion about clarity?
Yeah, I think so. That's a really great question, and I think it's very interesting. One reason there's so much discussion about it is because of the results that we found from our phase 1 trial with the improved speech perception, and to such a degree that was quite surprising. And the only way to really explain that from the results we saw was that there must be increased clarity, and not necessarily an increase in volume. We're used to, when I mentioned during the panel that it made me rethink our whole field, we've almost always thought, I think we talked to our patients about this, that you need things to be louder first and then you can understand them better. But that's not actually necessarily true. In fact, it's probably more about clarity than just making sounds louder. So that's one reason we've emphasized this so much. It's actually a different way of thinking about it, that it's not the loudness so much as it is the clarity. You, of course, do need things to be audible, but that's also the clarity is what has eluded us up to this point, particularly with hearing aids, which are really designed to make sounds amplified and make them louder. Cochlear implants can do a nice job of making sounds clearer without the loudness, but it's an electrical signal, so it's very different from acoustic hearing, and people have to get used to that. So this is the first time we're really looking at being able to use the natural sound from the ear and provide clarity.
Yeah, I think just to follow on to what Chris is saying, we've been fascinated to learn there's so much energy emitted in this higher frequency range when we vocalize speech, right? And an example that's in the literature is if you vocalize the phrase "Oh, say can you see" by the dawn's early light, anytime there's an S, there's a lot of high frequency energy that's emitted by that phrase. And if you've got high frequency hearing loss, you're losing all that detail, and that detail really translates into a bigger struggle in communicating. So, and in that detail is clarity. That's kind of what Chris is alluding to. So we think directionally, this is really a new way that the field is going to move, and we think part of FX322's role is to help stimulate new research questions, right, in the very space that we're talking about with respect to clarity.
Okay. And I know the other thing that we think about, clarity, volume. How about in terms of, like you're saying, higher pitch sounds versus lower pitch sounds, for whether for frequency therapeutics or for other companies in terms of targeting, kind of is that at all what you think about in terms of the higher frequency versus lower frequency? Does that factor in terms of who you think may benefit, from either this drug or other drugs in this area?
I would say that the challenge is getting your drug to the specific frequencies. And what we know today about FX322 is it tends to focus primarily in the highest frequency range. And that's really the characteristics of how we designed it, and also the characteristics of the anatomy as well. Because there are a few barriers that one has to get through. But I think we are confident that we'll be able to advance the field with respect to drug delivery. And I could imagine a day where there is a drug that's designed specifically for low frequency hearing loss, right? And it's just, again, it's the field will continue to advance, and there's some pretty clever drug delivery folks out there. So I imagine one day that'll be the case.
Great, thank you. I'm just looking at the time. Any last comments or things to share from anybody here? Excellent.
Just again, as we said in the session, on behalf of Frequency, we want to thank all of our investigators, our study staff, the audiologists that work so hard, our study participants, and the fact that they've been willing to continue to press forward during the pandemic. We're just incredibly thankful, and we just want everybody to stay safe.
Mm-hmm. Great. Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you all. And thank you for everybody joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.